They say it takes a thief to catch a thief. And many investigators would say when it comes to murder cases, it's a similar process. You need to get inside the mind of the perpetrator to understand what motivated them, and then you can unlock the mystery. This is going to be the first in a series of videos where in the Jack the Ripper saga, I'm going to strip away a lot of the noise and just look at the bare facts. And to begin with, we're going to look at the crime scenes of Martha Tabram and Elizabeth Stride and how they fit into the Jack the Ripper saga. And I think you'll find the results rather surprising, so let's get straight into it and put it to the pub test. Now, I will not be diving deep into the history of both these victims, and I'm not doing this to discredit them or not pay them any attention at all. I've covered them quite extensively and put that human element to these two victims, but the main purpose, I should say, of this video is to really look at the facts without emotion. But we must, for those who aren't aware, I'm going to give a quick, brief rundown of both these victims. Martha Tabram, well, she had a troubled life. She did have 2 children. She was married, but alcohol really wrecked her life. Her husband gave her an ultimatum saying, it's either me or the drink, and she chose the drink. With no welfare state at the time, there was no social services. There was only one way many of these poor women could put a roof over their head. And that was becoming an unfortunate and selling themselves on the street. But now we jump forward to August 6th, 1888. And it's reported by Pearlie Poll that herself, Pearlie Poll that is, and Martha Tabram are out drinking, and they have met 2 soldiers, and they're going from pub to pub. Now, for these women, this is a double bonus because they're getting free drinks. These soldiers are getting them absolutely hammered, and then they're going to charge them for some services later. Now, it's said that the 4 leave the pub together, and then they go off their separate ways. Now, understanding that these women no doubt have their particular places to go. They're not going to take them back to a doss house or a lodging house where they might even have to share a room with someone else. No, they will take them to a spot that's secluded that will give them the privacy to conduct this business transaction. Yet, when Pearlie Poll goes off with her soldier, that's the last she would ever see of Martha Tabram alive. Now, it's important to state here that Pearlie Poll said they left that pub at 11:45 a.m. Going into the morning of August the 7th of 1888, P.C. Barrett saw a young Grenadier Guardsman standing near George's yard. And so he was like a soldier type of a person. And he goes up and says, buddy, what on earth are you doing? Now, understanding P.C. Barrett had been on the beat for a while, and it was not untoward to find some of these soldiers out of barracks and probably seeking the company of some of these women. And P.C. Barrett just doesn't want the headache, so he says, look, what's going on? And the guardsman says, oh, look, I'm waiting for me pal. He's just gone off with a lady. You just imagine P.C. Barrett right now. He's like, oh, great. I don't want to know. It's 2 a.m. in the morning because this happened at 2 a.m. And he'd be like, I don't care. He said, look, just, you shouldn't be out of barracks. Just hurry up. As soon as this bloke comes back, I don't want to know about it. And off he goes. But Martha Tabram's body was found very close to there in George's yard at 4:45 a.m. in the morning. though it's an eyewitness basically states that he possibly saw her body at 3 a.m., but it was too dark, and he thought it was just a homeless person having a sleep, because that was quite common. Now, Pearlie Pole is called in to identify the two soldiers she had been drinking with. Now, interestingly, they definitely were not Grenadier Guardsmen. They were from a totally different unit because of how they were dressed, according to what Pearlie Pole described. So they go to that particular barracks that she thought the soldiers were from, and she positively IDs two blokes. Well, they look into these two blokes and they rule them out and say, well, it couldn't have been them. Particularly the officer that she identified, well, he's guaranteed to be at home with his wife at the time. Now, you could say the wife is covering for him, but it would seem that Pearlie Pole was mistaken in the identity. So does that mean she's an unreliable witness? Well, here's an interesting thing, because PC Barrett, he identifies two of the Grenadier Guardsmen. Now he only saw one, but he's picked out two that he says, well, it could have been him. And both of those blokes are also eliminated as being the soldier that he saw. Now, you would say that PC Barrett would not be an unreliable witness. He's not making up a story. So that is significant, because we would automatically assume that Pearlie Pole being drunk and she's probably making up this story, but now the police officer also can't identify his person that he saw. So you can understand why this would be difficult, because you put anyone in a uniform and they all mostly look the same. Yeah, if you really paid attention, you can see the difference. But in the dark, and you're only taking a quick glimpse, and you're not really thinking anything bad's happened, it would be hard to pick these blokes out. Yet there is a conflict here, and there's a massive, massive conflict. Firstly, I will have to state that Pearlie Pole disappeared for 3 days. So when she first gave her testimony to the police saying what happened with her and Martha Tabram, and they're off drinking with these two soldiers, she just went missing for 3 days. They couldn't find her. So that was that 3 days before she came back to ID these soldiers. Yet the general consensus of what happened to Martha Tabram that most people put out is Pearlie Pole's version of events. That Martha was drinking with those blokes. And yet, nobody back in the day verifies that. And what I mean is, Pearlie Pole said they went to various establishments. Nobody at any of those establishments saw Martha and Pearlie Pole together. They never saw Pearlie Pole and Martha with two soldiers. They never saw Martha with the soldier at all. They saw her in the pubs by herself. And the last verifiable sighting of Martha Tabram that night was at a pub at 11 a.m. But she was alone, as I've just stated. And there's a conflict in the timing as well, because Pearlie Pole said they left the bar at 11:45 a.m. Well, PC Barrett didn't see this soldier, and everyone makes that connection straight away, saying, see, there was a soldiers, and there was a soldier there, so that had to be the story. But that was at 2 a.m. that PC Barrett saw that person. Now, if these people, being Martha and Pearlie Pole and the two soldiers, have gone their separate ways to conduct business, that business did not go on for a couple of hours. That transaction normally was quite quick. So that basically blows Pearlie Pole's story out of the water. In fact, we have to discount it. We can't consider what she says as facts at all. She is a totally unreliable witness. But why'd she come up with such a detailed and quite fanciful story? I mean, what benefit was it to her to mention this at all to the police? Well, we really don't know. So this would only be speculation, and I'm trying to keep speculation out of this particular case, but she could have sold the story to the media, because this case did make some press. In fact, the press were starting to ramp up concerns of what were happening to some of these women, some of the unfortunates, particularly not long before this. The case of Emma Smith occurred, and that was just horrific. But that was done by a gang of people, at least 3. And if you want to look up that story, there is a video about that on this channel. But it's why the media were now looking at these things. And so Pearlie Pohl may have saw this as a way of making a quick bit of cash. She had association with Martha Tabram, but only for a couple of months before this event. But by an absolute coincidence, the second canonical victim of Jack the Ripper, Annie Chapman, roomed with Pearlie Pohl for an amount of time at a doss house. But the connection a lot of these people have that are well known in the Jack the Ripper saga, you sometimes start questioning it has to be more than coincidental, but we're not getting into that today. But let's look then at the facts of this crime scene with Martha Tabram. It is verified she was out drinking. She was seen at the pubs. The only other thing we know for sure is that most likely she was deceased at 3 a.m. because someone prior in George's Yard saw nothing in the area where the body was found. 3 a.m. someone saw what they thought was a homeless person sleeping, and then it was 4:45 when the light started to come up that they identified the fact that this was Martha Tabram and she was dead. Now, the cause of death was a stab wound with a long knife into the chest, into the heart. And then subsequently, after she was dead, about 36 or more, or around about there, stab wounds with a smaller knife, they say possibly a clasp knife or a pen knife, were inflicted on the body. Now, that piece of information about the wounds after she had passed away, and we are unfortunately going to get into that scene in a lot more detail yet, but that is significant. Now, why? Well, it's because most times when a murder occurs, the end of life to the victim ceases the attack, because that's the purpose of doing it. I'll give an example of a video done here of Paula Gorzo, who was supposedly the S-Bahn murderer, but regardless, the S-Bahn murderer on the German trains during World War II strangled a couple of women. At least he thought he had strangled them to death, but it only rendered a couple of them unconscious. But he thinks they're dead and throws them off the train. A couple of them survived. You see, but people think that, without going into it, strangling someone takes a lot more time and effort than what a lot of people originally imagined, because they just see TV shows. That's not how it works. But you see, the S-Bahn murderer, well, he thought his job was done. They're dead. So he ceased the attack and was just disposing of the body. Not the case here with Martha Tabram. It is a very unique situation that someone will be attacked after they're deceased. So the question is, will we see a pattern here? Well, let's jump forward to Elizabeth Stride, the third canonical victim of Jack the Ripper and the first person murdered on the night of September the 30th, or morning of September the 30th, in 1888, as part of what became known as the double event. But again, just a brief history on Elizabeth Stride without too much detail. She was born in Sweden. She did emigrate to England and ended up in that London area in Whitechapel. Oddly, at the age of 18 in Sweden, she did have a charge of prostitution. So they weren't considered unfortunates in Sweden as such, but she had that on her record. She got married, though, over in England, and hence her last name became Stride. And her and her husband ran a cafe together, and it was going okay. But she says in 1878, she's on a boat, I think it was the Princess Alice, and it was a big event. A tragedy happened and lots of people died. She said she was on the boat with her husband and 2 children. She survived, but they passed away. And again, no welfare state. She's now on the street by herself. She meets a bloke by the name of Michael Kidney, and they have a bit of a tumultuous relationship, we could say. That is something we are also diving into during this video. Yet, a bit of an odd thing happened. I mean, husband died on a boat in 1878, yet then somehow, 6 years later in 1884, it's reported that he died of heart failure. So the husband hadn't died on the boat. They had split up, but he wasn't dead yet. And there's no record at all that she ever had children, other than her own statement. And it is suggested here that she was using that story of the husband and the children to garner sympathy from the church she was involved in, and perhaps they would give her some money. Obviously, that didn't keep on going, or at least not enough, so she was, at times, working as an unfortunate to make money. And at this time, on September the 30th, 1888, herself and her boyfriend at the time, Michael Kidney, well, they weren't living together. But at this scene, we do have an eyewitness to the event who was really considered by the police as having seen Jack the Ripper. And that man was Israel Swartz. Now, it's important to state here he could not speak English. He'd been in the country for a little while, though, but a lot of people in that area spoke Yiddish, so learning English wasn't that important. But he's walking up Burner Street near Dutfield's yard, where Elizabeth Stride's body is later found, and sees what he says. He verifies at the morgue that he saw Elizabeth Stride with a bloke, and this bloke is pushing her or pulling her, either varying reports here. Understanding he couldn't speak English, but regardless, this person is throwing this poor woman to the ground. Now, he thought this was a domestic incident, and he did not want to get involved. That was common. If some husband or bloke was laying into a woman for whatever reason, the natural thing was, well, that's for them to sort out. Anyway, Israel Swartz hears this man look up and yell Lipsky. At least that's one version of events, but then another bloke appears, out of another place, and someone called Lipsky to him, and he took off. But then later, Elizabeth Stride's body is found in Dutfield's yard. The injuries to her and how she passed away was a cut to the throat, but it's also determined that she had defensive wounds on her body as well. Now, there was no post-mortem attack this time, and it's assumed by many that it was Louis Deemschutz who basically managed the International Working Men's Club, where Dutfield's yard was in Burner Street. He's coming back from the market very late, obviously, and finds the body there, and it's suggested that Jack the Ripper, well, he got disturbed. He couldn't finish his crime, and he's taken off. Is that the case, though? See, that is speculation. There is no verifiable evidence that event occurred. But what pattern do we see in this particular crime? Well, see, oddly, the Elizabeth Stride murder is a bit of an outlier when it comes to the Jack the Ripper victims, the other 4 canonical victims, because of the no injuries after death. But the one that really probably clinched it was the attack that happened later that night to Catherine Eddowes and the throat being cut. Because it is actually a very rare way of murdering people. Normally, you attack someone with a knife, you are stabbing at them. Like happened to Martha Tabram. That was a stab attack, not a cut of the throat. So the connection is this had to have been the same perpetrator, because there was already two that happened prior to this, being Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. And so then on the same night when the police discover two bodies killed in very similar ways, immediate connection is Jack the Ripper. But let's just for a moment go through the other 4 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, starting with Polly Nichols. Yeah, she was found in Bucks Row with the throat cut. And at the time, initially, that was thought to be the only wounds inflicted on her. And then later, they found a person had started to cut into the body in other areas after she'd passed away. But there were no defensive wounds found on her. Not long after that, Annie Chapman in Hanbury Street was found at the back of 29 Hanbury Street. And again, throat cut, this time a lot more wounds inflicted after death. But then Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, she also was killed quickly, no defensive wounds. And then the perpetrator took body parts and everything, and her scene was terrible. And then leading to Mary Kelly in Miller's Court, the only victim murdered inside her own room. They've never found the heart from that victim. And in fact, the person on that bed was totally unidentifiable. What happened there was absolutely brutal. Many, many wounds inflicted after death. Remembering, no post-mortem wounds on Elizabeth Stride, however. Let's look now at Martha Tabram and what happened to her in George's Yard and see if there's a pattern. Now, the way her body was found, it is highly likely, in fact, it's strongly suggested that the perpetrator was on top of her for obvious reasons because a business transaction was taking place. She was totally vulnerable. He brings up the long knife, probably totally unseen by Martha, and stabs her in the chest, which causes death very quickly. And then he goes about attacking the body after that. So like Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, and most likely Mary Kelly, though that crime scene we don't know for sure, but those 4, the same pattern occurred. Quick immobilization, wounds after death. And those wounds afterwards, as mentioned, are very, very rare. Yet let's now go back to the Elizabeth Stride crime scene. What does it look like? Well, it looks like a domestic violence situation. In fact, Israel Swartz said it looked like a domestic violence situation. And once the person has passed away, the crime ceased. Yes, we can speculate that Jack the Ripper was interrupted and so forth and then had to go on and commit another crime, but that's not what the evidence really points to. She had defensive wounds. Israel Swartz saw that pushing and shoving and her being thrown to the ground. So who comes to mind then that may have perpetrated this crime? If you were back there and looked at this as a standalone case, with the evidence of the eyewitness and the evidence of the defensive wounds, straight away you would maybe think of, well, the spouse. Because most times in domestic violence, it will be the spouse causing the crime, like doing the murder. Well, what was Michael Kidney's bit of track record? Elizabeth Stride had taken him to court. She charged him with beating her up. He did front to the judge, but Elizabeth Stride doesn't show. So case gets dismissed. Michael Kidney himself states that in the house that they were sharing, it was padlocked, but they only had one key. And you could guess who had possession of that key. Naturally, Michael Kidney. Now, if that is not controlling behaviour, he could literally lock Elizabeth Stride in the house. And she was trying to make a break away from this terrible relationship she was in. No doubt she was being beaten. And how sad is it that Elizabeth Stride was better to be out on the street as an unfortunate than in a relationship with this bloke. The police did consider him as a suspect in this crime. And that's because, despite the domestic violence charge and the fact that people knew that they argued quite a lot and had a big blue just before this, he denied it initially. He said, oh, no, we were getting along fine. Until the evidence comes in, he goes, oh, okay, well, we did have a bit of a disagreement, but I did not do this crime. Yet it sort of ticks all the boxes of someone like him perhaps doing it. But you would say where she was found, if she was fighting for her life with this, partner, well, people at that International Working Men's Club would have heard something, but absolutely not. Some people said they did hear some faint cries, but they were singing up in that club. And it wasn't that uncommon to hear people calling out of a night time in that Whitechapel area. It was a rough place. And as we saw, even if you saw an event happening with Israel Swartz, most people wouldn't want to get involved anyway. So those noises would just drown out. But the point I'm making here is there is no verifiable evidence that the perpetrator of the Elizabeth Stride crime was ever interrupted at all. In fact, the evidence more suggests it was just a typical murder where once the victim is dead, the attack ceased. And there is one other major difference to Elizabeth Stride's crime and all the others, including Martha Tabram. Catherine Eddowes was also seen with what many people believe was Jack the Ripper just before she was murdered in Mitre Square. But that person was not pushing and shoving with her. He wasn't coming over as a bad person. In fact, he was having a good conversation and they were having a laugh. Now, it's also said with Mary Kelly. She was last seen entering her room with a carroty mustache person. There was no coercion going on. She wasn't being dragged. She wasn't being pushed. People saw that. They just knew this was a regular business transaction that Mary Kelly would be doing. You're going to say, well, hang on, Owen, what about what George Hutchinson saw? Well, we are going to look at that. Again, we are stripping away all the noise. We are looking at only verifiable facts. But then you would say with Martha Tabram, well, that was a frenzied attack. She got stabbed and then stabbed heaps more times. Maybe that also was personal. Perhaps it was the husband. He was sick of it, knowing that his wife was out on the streets. Well, no, it's different again because in these frenzied attacks, you don't switch knives as a general rule. Like you don't stab someone with a long knife and then get out a smaller knife. Like you wouldn't hit someone over the head with a hammer and knock them out and then get a spoon and start beating them all around the body with it. It just doesn't make sense. You would keep going with the hammer. And that's the point here. With Mother Tabram, she was attacked, but somebody was enjoying the process after she'd passed away. But why do it in the first place? But you see, in our mind, well, at least hopefully in your mind, I mean, I don't know how you all think, but hopefully everyone viewing here just doesn't understand how somebody would go about doing this, like murdering somebody and then continuing to attack them knowing that they've passed away. It just seems unfathomable to us. But sadly, it's not. We all do understand why they do it. And I'll explain. If you have a dinner party, like you plan it, don't you? You invite your friends over. You serve the meal. You've put a lot of thought into what you're going to do. You've done a lot of preparation. And then you execute the dinner party. And afterwards, you sit back and you have that feeling of joy. I think it's endorphins or whatever are going through your system. And then you think to yourself, I'd like to do that again. But how could I improve it? How could I make the dinner party a bit better? The coleslaw probably was a little bit dry. I could probably throw a different rub on the beef that I roasted and just see how that goes. You wouldn't do the same dinner party every single time, but what you're chasing is that feeling that you have. You just feel good about it. Now, that may not be your thing. You might do other things that bring you enjoyment and you look forward to the next event. Now, that is the same with these serial killers. That's how they view their actions, as something that brings them emotional joy. Yes, we don't understand why doing these crimes brings them that feeling, but that's what drives them. And they go through the same process. They'll do a crime and then say, well, how could that be improved? Now, applying that idea of thinking about things and how you would improve all of a sudden makes the Martha Tabram crime make sense in the Jack the Ripper saga. Why so? Well, there was always a chance, stabbing at the heart, even though he had full control, he was on top of her. What if he slightly missed? Well, she could probably fight back. She probably wouldn't have made it out, no, but could have caused a scene. He might have had to run away, which perhaps he had to do previously. This time he got lucky. And he's probably thinking, well, how can I improve that so that my victim doesn't struggle and I can do what I really wanted to do, which is the after-death attack. Now what enjoyment this person was getting from it, don't know, but obviously they must have been, because this is what they were doing. And so then the process was, well, the quicker way to immobilize them, and definitely making sure I'm going to get this right, is then a cut to the throat. And also then escalating up, not just stabbing the person, but now starting to cut into the bodies. Yeah, this is pretty horrific and rather deep, so I do apologize. But Jack the Ripper would not have started with Martha Tabram. No, there would have had to have been an escalation along the way. So is there a crime that we could point to say that was Jack the Ripper? Well, yes, there is. And that was Annie Millwood. She was attacked in 1888, before Martha Tabram. She was stabbed by someone in the street. Randomly came up to her. She says, look, I didn't know the bloke. Randomly just stabbing at her many, many times with a small knife. She gets away, goes to the infirmary. Now, she died 10 days after the event. She survived initially, but then died from natural causes due to blood clotting. Obviously, she died from this attack. It just took a little while. So let me just read to you what this infirmary said. It appears the deceased was admitted to the Whitechapel Infirmary suffering from numerous stabs in the legs and lower part of the body. She stated that she'd been attacked by a man whom she did not know and who stabbed her with a clasp knife which he took from his pocket. No one appears to have seen the attack, and as far as at present ascertained, there is only the woman's statement to bear out the allegations of an attack, though that she had been stabbed cannot be denied. mean, are they serious? She's got stab wounds all over her, and they go, well, she's the only one verifying she was actually attacked by some bloke. That's just unbelievable. But then, like you could beat your wife in the street and people would walk away saying, let them sort it out. So, I mean, hopefully women's rights have moved a lot further forward than they were back then. There is still a long way to go, I know, but my goodness, that would have been a pretty rough time for these poor women back then. But we see there the escalation. I'm suggesting this was an attack by Jack the Ripper. And he's doing this and then realizing that, look, this person's going to get away. That's cutting down my fun. So what can I do next? And then the Martha Tabram crime occurs. Now, I will say, looking at the evidence right now, and you might disagree with me, and that is fine, I would say that Martha Tabram was a victim of Jack the Ripper, and Elizabeth Stride wasn't. It's not to say that Elizabeth Stride's death is any less, important. What happened to her was absolutely tragic. But if you take that crime out of the Jack the Ripper saga, a lot of more things make sense. In fact, seeing the slowly ramping up of the escalation in the crimes, I can see how Mary Kelly then fits into the Jack the Ripper saga. For a long time, I've been saying I cannot see one person committing all of these because of Elizabeth Stride and Mary Kelly. Now, I'm not saying I've given up fully on some of my Mary Kelly theories, but I am starting to look at things a little bit differently. And as I stated earlier, this is a series where we will be maybe getting really down to what can be proven and verifiable to the best knowledge that we have today. So I'm choosing to take Elizabeth Stride's crime out of this particular list. And if I was back in that day as a police officer, I think I could make a very strong case to put to the prosecutor that Michael Kidney was the perpetrator. Whether I could get a conviction, I don't know. And that often is the problem. You can lay out all the evidence, you can say this is what it proves, but to convict someone, well, that's a higher level. But now going to the Mary Kelly crime scene just briefly, George Hutchinson does come into it, and he says he saw Mary Kelly quite late in the night, around 2 a.m. or round about then, and he gave a detailed description of who he saw as Jack the Ripper. Too detailed for a lot of people's thoughts. But why he gets a lot of credibility is because another eyewitness around that time when they believe Mary Kelly was attacked in her room at 13 Miller's Court was that a bloke was seen hovering around outside. Now, he states in his testimony that I was concerned for Mary Kelly and I saw her go into this room with this bloke and I'm hanging around outside in the freezing cold, mind you, and gives up after an hour or so and disappears. And someone saw someone hovering around, so they assume, well, that probably was George Hutchinson, because how would he know that someone was outside 13 Miller's Court at that same time? Well, here's the interesting thing. George Hutchinson only came forward 3 days after the crime in Miller's Court. And that witness who saw someone standing outside Miller's Court had already, their statement had already been plastered all through the papers. Also, he mentioned that this person seen with Mary Kelly had a red handkerchief, and that's the same type of red handkerchief seen by Joseph Lawender at Catherine Eddowes' crime near Mitre Square. So he could easily have put all of this together himself just from newspaper events and then gone to make a statement. Why? Well, he got a fair bit of traction with some press reports and everything. Why did Pearlie Poll probably make up her story? Who knows? The point is, we cannot verify a single thing that he said. Therefore, we need to discount it. He was just an unreliable witness. The one thing that we can verify is that Mary Kelly was last seen heading into her room at midnight with a carroty mustache bloke, and she was singing for close to an hour. Now, why was she singing for an hour if she's just conducting a business transaction? Well, that person obviously was in no rush to leave the room for whatever reason. And we probably will get down that path in coming videos shortly. But then that leads to one other particular thing we need to consider. If they got the Elizabeth Stride crime wrong back in the day and put it in the list as a Jack the Ripper crime, did they have others wrong? Could have more attacks happened following Mary Kelly? But you'll say, no, it can't be the case, because Melville McNaughton, who was one of the heads of the police, Donald Swanson, who was leading the Jack the Ripper investigation, Sir Robert Anderson, all these ones are making comments, and we read in their memoirs. We read in little margins, in memos. Jack the Ripper was caught, or at least identified. He either jumped into the River Thames, he either died as a lunatic in an asylum. But regardless, after Mary Kelly, there were no more crimes. The police were no longer really investigating it. But we know that's not the case. They went to see William Berry, who was living in Whitechapel, who murdered his wife. They travelled to investigate him as being Jack the Ripper. When a woman by the name of Frances Coles, she got murdered, they arrested a bloke named Tom Sadler. Now remember, Joseph Lawender was an eyewitness who saw what they say was Jack the Ripper and Catherine Eddowes that very night. He identified him not as someone of Jewish background, but fair-skinned is what he said, which would have meant a more traditional English-looking person, but looked like a sailor. That's important because Tom Sadler, well, he was a sailor. He worked on boats. So we're not talking like Popeye here, but Whitechapel's near the River Thames, so you would have a lot of people in that industry, so they have this look, and probably certain clothing that they wear. Firstly, though, they're asking Thomas Sadler, what were you doing on the night of the 17th of July, 1889? That's significant, because that night, a woman by the name of Alice Mackenzie was murdered. Then they bring Joseph Lawender in and say, was this the bloke? Is Tom Sadler the bloke you saw back with Catherine Eddowes at Mitre Square those couple of years ago? He can't identify him. He says, I don't know. Why were the police making the connection to Alice Mackenzie and Frances Coles to the Jack the Ripper crimes? If, according to all the high brass, the investigation's over. And if that is the case, who could have been Jack the Ripper? We're going to look at that in the next video. But just to draw a line under this one, I think it really needs to be considered. And I know there will not be a consensus here. So yeah, get those fingers working and hit those keyboards. I'm interested to know your thoughts. But should Martha Tabram be included on the official Jack the Ripper list and Elizabeth Stride taken off it? Well, let me know what you think. As always, this is the pub test. Open to ideas and having that conversation. But yes, this series is heading somewhere. So make sure that you like and subscribe so that you get to see all of this content. And thank you so much for watching. I genuinely mean that. And thank you all who are sharing this content around everywhere. I'm Owen. You've been watching The Pub Test, and we'll see you on the next one.